Good evening, my lovelies. I've got a book here for stories at bedtime. It's witch stories. Do you think they could be frightening? Should we try one? Let's try Edward and Anna. Edward and Anna by Jane Launchbury. Far away at the edge of a great mountain range there lived a poor woman and her 2 children, a boy called Edward and a girl called Anna. 2 winters ago their loving father had set off to hunt deer in the mountains, but there had been a terrible avalanche and he never ever returned. Every night the children lit a lamp in the tiny cottage window in the hope that it would guide him home, but all that ever came were big furry moths spinning dizzily towards the light. One dark night there was a terrible storm in the mountains. Lightning flashed across the sky, thunder crashed, and echoes rumbled down the valley. Edward and Anna rushed into their mother's room and huddled against her in bed. Outside the rain lashed against the windows, and the wild wind howled angrily through the trees and down the chimney. The lamp at the cottage window flared and flickered, sending eerie shadows dancing over the walls, but it didn't go out. "Don't worry," said the children's mother, cuddling them to her. "It's only a horrid old storm. It'll soon pass." But the storm got worse, and suddenly a great thunder crash followed by a terrible creaking and screaming, as though a vast monster was heading straight for them. The old chestnut tree behind the cottage was tearing its roots from the ground. It seemed to fall in slow motion onto the little cottage. There was a horrible sound as the roof timbers smashed. Tiles flew in all directions. Twigs, tiles and rain poured in through the gaping hole. The children and their mother took refuge in an old woodshed. At least it was dry in there. All night the storm raged, but the cottage window lamp burned steadily on. When daylight came and the last rumbles of the thunder had vanished over the mountains, the family crept out of their woodshed. They looked gloomily at their home. There was a very little left of the roof, sadly. They walked around the soggy rooms, looking up at the brightening sky through the gaping holes. "Whatever are we going to do?" sighed Anna. She knew that they could not afford a new roof. And then she had an idea. Once she had gone up into the mountains with her father to gather reeds from beside a great blue lake. "I know," she gasped. "We can cut reeds and thatch the roofs ourselves." So as soon as the sun had fully risen, the children's mother gave them a bag with the last small scraps of bread and cheese. She told them to keep to the paths and hurry back home before dark, and then she waved goodbye, and Edward and Anna set off for the lake in the mountains. For hours the children walked up winding paths that led higher and higher into the mountain range. At last they saw the great blue lake shimmering in a valley below them, and they ran cheerfully down towards it. Around the edges of the lake grew tall reeds that Anna had remembered. The reeds grew most thickly in the dark inlet, shadowed by a mountain crag. Edward and Anna down to work there straight away. It was much quicker than cutting the reeds that grew in the sunshine, but there was a chilly feel to the place. Soon they became aware of another sound above the croaking of the mountain frogs, which were all around them. It sounded like a wheezy voice whispering something. Edward and Anna stopped work and looked around. They couldn't see anyone. And then they heard the voice again. This time it was much clearer. "Swish, swash, who dares to take reeds that grow in my lake?" A bony old woman crept out of the shadows. She was the ugliest person they had ever seen. She was bent over a stick, and she hobbled closer to the children, and the children saw that she had skin of greenish and yellow colour. Anna and Edward backed away, but there was no escape behind them. There was only the tangled reed bed and a deep blue lake. Around them the mountain frogs had begun to croak in unison. They seemed to be saying something. "Beware of the witch of the lake," they croaked over and over again. Then the old woman spoke in quite a friendly voice. "You must be hungry, my little chickens. Come into my house and I'll give you a nice meal." Then you'll be strong enough to cut as many reeds as you need. Edward and Anna were a little comforted by this, but still they didn't move. Come along, my little froglets, she said, edging towards them. This time they didn't have any choice. Taking them by the hands, the old woman led the two children into her house. Outside, the frogs croaked louder than ever. Here, child, help me light the fire, she crooned to Anna. Then I can cook you a real feast. You, boy, go and fetch fresh water from the well outside and fill this pot, she said, pointing a crooked finger at a vast cauldron. Hurry now. Edward went gloomily out to the well. He did not trust the old woman, but he couldn't just run off and leave his sister. He leaned over the well and sighed heavily. It was a very deep well, and his sigh echoed around and around in its depths. And then he heard another sound. On a ledge just outside the well shaft, there sat a handsome green frog with shiny yellow eyes. Drops of water glittered on its back like jewels. It looked up at Edward and spoke. The old woman is a wicked witch. She is going to eat you up. You must trick her and escape. Oh no, grasped Edward. How can I trick her? And then he had an idea. How deep is the well? He asked. Deeper than night, replied the frog, pushing a little pebble down the shaft. Edward waited to hear the splash as it hit the water, and when it eventually came, the sound was so faint he could hardly hear it. Stay there, kind frog. Keep croaking as loudly as you can, he said, and then he ran back to the witch's house. Come outside, called Edward. There's a huge fat frog in the well. It would make a delicious meal. The old witch needed no further bidding, and she lurched over the well, and Anna ran after her. The little frog was hiding in a crack and croaking with all its might. The old witch peered into the depths of the well, but she couldn't see any huge fat frogs. It's down there, said Edward, pointing into the darkness. Down there! Can't you see it? The old woman leaned even further into the well, licking her lips. Oh. Now, shouted Edward, push! He and Anna gave the witch a great shove, and the witch let out a shriek and toppled over into the well. Down and down she tumbled. Edward listened for the splash, and at last it came. The echoes lasted for quite a while, and then all was quiet. The wicked witch had gone forever, and then out of the gloom they heard the croaking of the frog. Edward leaned into the well and lifted the little creature out in his hands. Thank you, frog, he whispered, and then he kissed gently on its head. There was a blinding flash, and the little frog turned into a tall man. Anna! Edward! He cried. Father! Gasped the children, rushing into his arms. We thought you had been swept away forever in the avalanche, said Anna. No, said their father, the wicked witch caught me. She turned me into a frog for supper, but I escaped, and I've been living here in the well ever since. You must have broken the spell. And then the children told their father about the great storm that had destroyed their roof, and how they had come to gather reeds by the lake. Oh, my clever, brave children, cried their father. We must collect the reeds and go home to your mother as fast as we can. It was nearly dark as they set off down the stony path. As the sky got darker, a tiny glow from the foot of the mountain got stronger and stronger. The children's mother had lit the lamp in the cottage window, and its light drew them all back home to safety at last. What a brilliant story! What a brilliant ending! I hope you enjoyed that. Good night.